Bluebeard, the autobiography of Rabo Karabakian, 1916 to 1988. A novel by Kurt Vonnegut Jr. Read by Ron Gabaldon.
Part 1, Chapters 1 through 4.
This book is for Sears Berman. What can I say? R.K. 1. Having written the end to this story of my life, I find it prudent to scamper back here to before the beginning, to my front door, so to speak, and to make this apology to arriving guests. I promised you an autobiography, but something went wrong in the kitchen. It turns out to be a diary of this past troubled summer, too. Well, we can always send out for pizzas if necessary. Come in, come in. I am the erstwhile Armenian painter Rabo Karabakian, a one-eyed man. I was born of immigrant parents in San Ignacio, California in 1916. I begin this autobiography 71 years later. To those unfamiliar with the ancient mysteries of arithmetic, that makes this year 1987. I was not born a cyclops. I was deprived of my left eye while commanding a platoon of Army engineers, curiously enough artists of one sort or another in civilian life, in Luxembourg near the end of World War II. We were specialists in camouflage, but at that time were fighting for our lives as ordinary infantry. The unit was composed of artists, since it was the theory of someone in the Army that we would be especially good at camouflage. And so we were. And we were. What hallucinations we gave the Germans as to what was dangerous to them behind our lines and what was not. Yes, and we were allowed to live like artists, too, hilariously careless in matters of dress and military courtesy. We were never attached to a unit as quotidian or as a division or even as corps. We were under orders which came directly from the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, which assigned us temporarily to this or that general who had heard of our astonishing illusions. He was our patron for just a little while, permissive and fascinated and finally grateful. Then off we went again. Since I had joined the regular army and become a lieutenant 2 years before the United States backed into the war, I might have attained the rank of lieutenant colonel at least by the end of the war, but I refused all promotions beyond captain in order to remain with my happy family of 36 men. That was my first experience with a family that large. My second came after the war, when I found myself a friend and seeming peer of those American painters who have now entered art history as founders of the abstract expressionist school. My mother and father had families bigger than those two of mine back in the old world. And of course, their relatives back there were blood relatives. They lost their blood relatives to a massacre by the Turkish Empire of about 1 million of its Armenian citizens, who were thought to be treacherous for two reasons. First, because they were clever and educated, and second, because so many of them had relatives on the other side of Turkey's border with its enemy, the Russian Empire. It was an age of empires. So was this one, not all that well disguised. The German Empire, allied with the Turks, sent impassive military observers to evaluate this century's first genocide, a word which did not exist in any language then. The word is now understood everywhere to mean a carefully planned effort to kill every member, be it man, woman, or child, of a perceived subfamily of the human race. The problems presented by such ambitious projects are purely industrial. How to kill that many big, resourceful animals cheaply and quickly, make sure that nobody gets away, and dispose of mountains of meat and bone afterwards. The Turks, in their pioneering effort, had neither the aptitude for really big business nor the specialized machinery required. The Germans would exhibit both par excellence, only 1/4 of a century later. The Turks simply took all the Armenians they could find in their homes or places of work or refreshment or play or worship or education or whatever, marched them out into the countryside and kept them away from food and water and shelter, and shot and bashed them and so on until they all appeared to be dead. It was up to dogs and vultures and rodents and so on, and finally worms, to clean up the mess afterwards. My mother, who wasn't yet my mother, only pretended to be dead among the corpses. My father, who wasn't yet her husband, hid in the shit and piss of a privy behind the schoolhouse where he was a teacher when the soldiers came. The school day was over, and my father-to-be was all alone in the schoolhouse writing poetry, he told me one time. Then he heard the soldiers coming and understood what they meant to do. Father never saw or heard the actual killing. For him, the stillness of the village, of which he was the only inhabitant at nightfall, all covered with shit and piss, was his most terrible memory of the massacre. Although my mother's memories from the old world were more gruesome than my father's, since she was right there in the killing fields, she somehow managed to put the massacre behind her and find much to like in the United States, and to daydream about a family future here. My father never did. I am a widower. My wife, née Edith Taft, who was my second such, she left me this 19-room house on the waterfront of East Hampton, Long Island, which had been in her Anglo-Saxon family from Cincinnati, Ohio for 3 generations. Her ancestors surely never expected it to fall into the hands of a man with a name as exotic as Rabo Karabakian. If they haunt this place, they do it with such Episcopalian good manners that no one has so far noticed them. If I were to come upon the spook of one of them on the grand staircase, and he or she indicated that I had no rights to this house, I would say this to him or her: blame the Statue of Liberty. Dear Edith and I were happily married for 20 years. She was a grandniece of William Howard Taft, the 27th President of the United States and the 10th Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. She was the widow of a Cincinnati sportsman and investment banker named Richard Fairbanks, Jr., himself descended from Charles Warren Fairbanks, a United States Senator from Indiana and then Vice President under Theodore Roosevelt. We came to know each other long before her husband died, when I persuaded her, and him too, although this was her property, not his, to rent their unused potato barn to me for a studio. They had never been potato farmers, of course. They had simply bought land from a farmer next door to the north, away from the beach, in order to keep it from being developed. With it had come the potato barn. Edith and I did not come to know each other well until after her husband died, and my first wife, Dorothy, and our 2 sons, Terry and Henri, moved out on me. I sold our house, which was in the village of Springs, 6 miles north of here, and made Edith's barn not only my studio, but my home. That improbable dwelling, incidentally, is invisible from the main house, where I am writing now. Edith had no children by her first husband, and she was past childbearing when I transmogrified her from being Mrs. Richard Fairbanks, Jr. into being Mrs. Rabo Karabakian instead. So we were a very tiny family indeed in this great big house with its 2 tennis courts and swimming pool, and its carriage house and its potato barn, and its 300 yards of private beach on the open Atlantic Ocean. One might think that my 2 sons, Terry and Henri Karabakian, whom I named in honor of my closest friend, the late Terry Kitchen, and the artist Terry and I most envied, Henri Matisse, might enjoy coming here with their families. Terry has 2 sons of his own now, Henri has a daughter, but they do not speak to me. So be it! So be it! I cry in this manicured wilderness. Who gives a damn? Excuse the outburst. Dear Edith, like all great earth mothers, was a multitude. Even when there were only 2 of us and the servants here, she filled this Victorian ark with love and merriment and hands-on domesticity. As privileged as she had been all her life, she cooked with the cook, gardened with the gardener, did all of our food shopping, fed the birds and the pets, and made personal friends of wild rabbits and squirrels and raccoons. But we used to have a lot of parties, too, and guests who sometimes stayed for weeks. Her friends and relatives, mostly. I have already said how matters stood and stand with my own few blood relatives, alienated descendants all. As for my synthetic relatives in the army, some were killed in the little battle in which I was taken prisoner, and which cost me 1 eye. Those who survived I have never seen or heard from since. It may be that they were not as fond of me as I was of them. These things happen. The members of my other big synthetic family, the abstract expressionists, are mostly dead now. Having been killed by everything from mere old age to suicide, the few survivors, like my blood relatives, no longer speak to me. So be it! So be it! I cry into this manicured wilderness. Who gives a damn? Excuse the outburst. All of our servants quit soon after Edith died. They said it had simply become too lonely here, so I hired some new ones, paying them a great deal of money to put up with me and all the loneliness. When Edith was alive, and the house was alive, the gardener and the 2 maids and the cook all lived here. Now only the cook, and as I say, a different cook, lives in. And he has the entire servants' quarters on the 3rd floor of the L to herself and her 15-year-old daughter. She is a divorced woman, a native of East Hampton, about 40, I would say. Her daughter, Celeste, does no work for me, but simply lives here and eats my food and entertains her loud and willfully ignorant friends on my tennis courts and in my swimming pool and on my private ocean front. She and her friends ignore me as though I were a senile veteran from some forgotten war, daydreaming away what little remains of his life as a museum guard. Why should I be offended? This house, in addition to being a home, shelters what is the most important collection of abstract expressionist paintings still in private hands. Since I have done no useful work for decades, what else am I really but a museum guard? And just as a paid museum guard would have to do, I answer as best I can the question put to me by visitor after visitor, stated in various ways, of course. What are these pictures supposed to mean? These paintings, which are about absolutely nothing but themselves, were my own property long before I married Edith. They are worth at least as much as all the real estate and stocks and bonds, including a 1/4 share in the Cincinnati Bengals professional football team, which Edith left to me. So I cannot be stigmatized as an American fortune hunter. I may have been a lousy painter, but what a collector I turned out to be. 2. It has been very lonely here since Edith died. The friends we had were hers, not mine. Painters shunned me since the ridicule my own paintings attracted and deserved, encouraged Philistines to argue that most painters were charlatans or fools. But I can stand loneliness if I have to. I stood it when I was a boy. I stood it for several years in New York City during the Great Depression. And after my first wife and my 2 sons left me in 1956, and I gave up on myself as a painter, I actually went looking for loneliness, and found it. I was a hermit for 8 years. How is that for a full-time job for a wounded vet? And I do have a friend who is mine, all mine. He is the novelist Paul Slazenger, a wounded World War II geezer like myself. He sleeps alone in a house next door to my old house in Springs. I say he sleeps there because he comes over here almost every day and is probably on the property somewhere at this very moment, watching a tennis game or sitting on the beach, staring out to sea, or playing cards with the cook in the kitchen, or hiding from everybody and everything, and reading a book where practically nobody ever goes on the far side of the potato barn. I don't think he writes much anymore. And, as I say, I don't paint at all anymore. I won't even doodle on a memo pad next to the downstairs telephone. A couple weeks ago, I caught myself doing exactly that, and I deliberately snapped the point off the pencil, broke the pencil in two, and I threw its broken body into a wastebasket like a baby rattlesnake which had wanted to poison me. Paul has no money. He eats supper with me here 4 or 5 times a week and gobbles directly from my refrigerator and fruit bowls during the daytime, so I am surely his primary source of nutriment. I have said to him many times after supper, "Paul, why don't you sell your house and get a little walking around money and move in here? Look at all the room I've got. And I'm never going to have a wife or a lady friend again, and neither are you. Jesus, who would have us? We look like a couple of gunshot iguanas. So move in. I won't bother you, and you won't bother me. What could make more sense?" His answer never varies much from this one. "I can only write at home." Some home with a busted refrigerator and nobody ever there but him. One time he said about this house, "Who could write in a museum?" Well, I am now finding out if that can be done or not. I am writing in this museum. Yes, it's true. Old Rabo-Karabakian, having disgraced myself in the visual arts, am now having a go at literature. A true child of the Great Depression, though, playing it safe, I am hanging on to my job as a museum guard. What has inspired this amazing career change by one so old? Cherchez les femmes! Uninvited, as nearly as I can remember, an energetic and opinionated and voluptuous and relatively young woman has moved in with me. She said she couldn't bear seeing and hearing me do absolutely nothing all day long, so why didn't I do something? Do anything? If I couldn't think of anything else to do, why didn't I write my autobiography? Why not indeed? She is so authoritative. I find myself doing whatever she says I must do. During our 20 years of marriage, my dear Edith never once thought of something for me to do. In the Army, I knew several colonels and generals like this new woman in my life, but they were men, and we were a nation at war. Is this woman a friend? I don't know what the hell she is. All I know is that she isn't going to leave again until she's good and ready, and that scares the pants off of me. Help! Her name is Circe Berman. She is a widow. Her husband was a brain surgeon in Baltimore, where she still has a house as big and empty as this one. Her husband Abe died of a brain hemorrhage 6 months ago. She is 43 years old, and she has selected this house as a nice place to live and work while she writes her husband's biography. There is nothing erotic about our relationship. I am 28 years Ms. Berman's senior, and I have become too ugly for anyone but a dog to love. I really do look like a gunshot iguana, and I am one-eyed besides. Enough is enough. Here's how we met. She wandered onto my private beach alone one afternoon, not knowing it was private. She had never heard of me since she hates modern art. She didn't know a soul in the Hamptons, and she was staying at the Maidstone Inn in the village about 1.5 miles from here. She had walked from there to the public beach and then across my border. I went down for my afternoon dip, and there she was, fully dressed and doing what Paul Slazenger does so much of, sitting on sand and staring out to sea. The only reason I reminded her being there, or anybody being there, was my ludicrous physique and the fact I would have to take off my eye patch before I went in. There's quite a mess under there, not unlike a scrambled egg. I was embarrassed to be seen up close. Paul Slazenger says, incidentally, that the human condition can be summed up in just one word, and this is the word: embarrassment. So I elected not to swim, but to sunbathe some distance away from her. I did, however, come close enough to say, "Hello." This was her curious reply. "Tell me how your parents died." What a spooky woman! She could be a witch. Who but a witch would have persuaded me to write my autobiography? She has just stuck her head in my room to say that it was time I went to New York City, where I haven't been since Edith died. I've hardly been out of this house since Edith died. New York City, here I come. This is terrible. "Tell me how your parents died," she said. I couldn't believe my ears. "I beg your pardon," I said. "What good is hello?" she said. She had stopped me in my tracks. "I've always thought it was better than nothing," I said, "but I could be wrong." "What does hello mean?" she said. And I said, I had always understood it to mean hello. "Well, it doesn't," she said. "It means don't talk about anything important. It means I'm smiling but not listening, so just go away." She went on to avow that she was tired of just pretending to meet people. "So sit down here," she said, "and tell Mama how your parents died." Tell Mama? Can you beat it? She had straight black hair and large brown eyes like my mother, but she was much taller than my mother and a little bit taller than me, for that matter. She was also much shapelier than my mother, who let herself become quite heavy, and who didn't care much what her hair looked like either, or her clothes. Mother didn't care because Father didn't care. And I told Mrs. Berman about my mother. She died when I was 12 of a tetanus infection she evidently picked up while working at a cannery in California. The cannery was built on the site of an old livery stable, and tetanus bacteria often colonize the intestines of horses without hurting them, and then become durable spores, armored little seeds when excreted. One of them lurking in the dirt around and under the cannery was somehow exhumed and sent traveling. After a long, long sleep, it awakened in paradise, something we would all like to do. Paradise was a cut in my mother's hand. "So long, Mama," said Circe Berman. There was that word Mama again. "Well, at least she didn't have to endure the Great Depression, which was only 1 year away," I said. "At least she didn't have to see her only child come home, a Cyclops from World War II. "And how did your father die?" she said. "In the Bijou Theater in San Ignacio in 1938, I said. "He went to the movie alone. He never considered remarrying. He still lived over the little store in California where he had got his first foothold in the economy of the United States of America. I had been living in Manhattan for 5 years then, and was working as an artist for an advertising agency. When the movie was over, the lights came on, and everybody went home but Father." "What was the movie?" she asked. And I said, "Captain's Courageous, starring Spencer Tracy and Freddie Bartholomew." What Father might have made of that movie, which was about cod fishermen in the North Atlantic, God only knows. Maybe he didn't see any of it before he died. If he did see some of it, he must have gotten rueful satisfaction from having absolutely nothing to do with anything he had ever seen or anybody he had ever known. He welcomed all proofs that the planet he had known and loved during his boyhood had disappeared entirely. That was his way of honoring all the friends and relatives he had lost in the massacre. You could say that he became his own Turk over here, knocking himself down and spitting on himself. He could have studied English and become a respected teacher there in San Ignacio, and started writing poetry again, or maybe translated the Armenian poets he loved so much into English. But that wasn't humiliating enough. Nothing would do but that he, with all his education, become what his father and grandfather had been, which was a cobbler. He was good at the craft, which he had learned as a boy, and which I would learn as a boy. But how he complained! At least he pitied himself in Armenian, which only Mother and I could understand. There weren't any other Armenians within 100 miles of San Ignacio. "I am looking for William Shakespeare, your greatest poet," he might say as he worked. "Have you ever heard of him?" He knew Shakespeare backwards and forwards in Armenian and would often quote him. "To be or not to be," for example. As far as he concerned was Linel Kham Klinil. "Tear out my tongue if you catch me speaking Armenian," he might say. That was the penalty the Turks set in the 17th century for speaking any language but Turkish, a ripped-out tongue. "Who are those people and what am I doing here?" he might say, with cowboys and Chinese and Indians passing by outside. "When is San Ignacio going to erect a statue of Mesrab Mashtots?" he might say. Mesrab Mashtots was the inventor of the Armenian alphabet, unlike any other, about 400 years before the birth of Christ. Armenians, incidentally, were the first people to make Christianity their national religion. 1 million, 1 million, 1 million, he might say. This is the generally accepted figure for the number of Armenians killed by the Turks in the massacre from which my parents escaped. That was 2/3 of Turkey's Armenians, and about half the Armenians in the whole world. There were about 6 million of us now, including my 2 sons and 3 grandchildren, who know nothing and care nothing about Mesrab Mashtot. Musadagh, he might say. This was the name of a place in Turkey where a small band of Armenian civilians fought Turkish militiamen to a standstill for 40 days and 40 nights before being exterminated, about the time my parents, with me in my mother's belly, arrived safe and sound in San Ignacio. "Thank you, Vartan Mamegonian," he might say. This was the name of a great Armenian national hero who led a losing army against the Persians in the 5th century. The Vartan Mamegonian father had in mind, however, was an Armenian shoe manufacturer in Cairo, Egypt, to which polyglot metropolis my parents escaped after the massacre. It was he, a survivor of an earlier massacre, who persuaded my naive parents, who had met on the road to Cairo, that they could find the streets paved with gold if only they could find their way to, of all places, San Ignacio, California. But that is a story I will tell another time. "If anybody has discovered what life is all about," Father might say, "it is too late. I am no longer interested. Never is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day," he might say. These, of course, are words from the American song Home on the Range, which he had translated into Armenian. He found them idiotic. "Tolstoy made shoes," he might say. This was a fact, of course. The greatest of Russian writers and idealists had, in an effort to do work that mattered, made shoes for a little while. May I say that I, too, could make shoes if I had to. Circe Berman says she can make pants if she has to. As she would tell me when we met on the beach, her father had a pants factory in Lackawanna, New York, until he went bankrupt and hanged himself. If my father had managed to survive Captains Courageous, starring Spencer Tracy and Freddie Bartholomew, and had lived to see the paintings I did after the war, several of which drew serious critical attention, and a few of which I sold for what was quite a bit of money at the time, he surely would have been among the great American majority which snorted and jeered at them. He wouldn't have just razzed me. He would have razzed my abstract expressionist pals, too, Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko and Terry Kitchen and so on, painters who are now, unlike myself, acknowledged to be some of the most brilliant artists ever to have produced not just by the United States, but by the whole damn world. But what sticks in my mind like a thorn now, and I haven't thought about this for years, he would have had no hesitation in razzing his own son, in razzing me. So thanks to the conversation Mrs. Berman struck up with me on the beach only 2 weeks ago, I am in a frenzy of adolescent resentment against a father who was buried almost 50 years ago. Let me off this hellish time machine. But there is no getting off this hellish time machine. I have to think now, even though it is the last I would ever want to think about, if I had a choice, that my own father would have laughed as hard as anybody when my paintings, thanks to unforeseen chemical reactions between the sizing of my canvases and the acrylic wall paint and colored tapes I had applied to them, all destroyed themselves. I mean, people who had paid $15,000 or $20,000 or even $30,000 for a picture of mine found themselves gazing at a blank canvas, all ready for a new picture, and ringlets of colored tapes and what looked like moldy Rice Krispies on the floor. It was a post-war miracle that did me in. I had better explain to my younger readers, if any, that the Second World War had many of the promised characteristics of Armageddon. A final war between good and evil so that nothing would do but that it be followed by miracles. Instant coffee was one, DDT was another. It was going to kill all the bugs, and it almost did. Nuclear energy was going to make electricity so cheap that it might not even be metered. It would also make another war unthinkable. Talk about loaves and fishes! Antibiotics would defeat all diseases. Lazarus would never die. How is that for a scheme to make the Son of God obsolete? Yes, and there was miraculous breakfast foods, and would soon be helicopters for every family. There were miraculous new fibers which could be washed in cold water and need no ironing afterwards. Talk about a war well worth fighting. During that war, we had a word for extreme man-made disorder, which was FUBAR, an acronym for fucked up beyond all recognition. Well, the whole planet is now FUBAR with post-war miracles, but back in the early 1960s, I was one of the first persons to be totally wrecked by one. An acrylic wall paint whose colors, according to advertisements of the day, would outlive the smile on Mona Lisa. The name of the paint was Sateen Duralux. Mona Lisa is still smiling, and your local paint dealer, if he has been in the business for any length of time, will laugh in your face if you ask for Sateen Duralux. Your father had the survivor's syndrome, said Circe Berman to me on my beach that day. He was ashamed not to be dead like all his friends and relatives. He was ashamed that I wasn't dead too, I said. Think of it as a noble emotion gone wrong, she said. He was a very upsetting father, I said. I'm sorry now that you've made me remember him. As long as we brought him back, she said, why don't you forgive him now? I've done it 100 times already, I said. This time I'm going to be smart and get a receipt. I went on to assert that Mother was more entitled to survivor syndrome than Father, since she had been right in the middle of the killing, pretending to be dead with people lying on top of her, and with screams and blood everywhere. She wasn't all that much older than the cook's daughter, Celeste. While Mother was lying there, she was looking right into the face of the corpse of an old woman who had no teeth, only inches away. The old woman's mouth was open, and inside it, and on the ground below it, was a fortune in unset jewels. If it weren't for those jewels, I told Mrs. Berman, I would not be a citizen of this great country, and would be in no position to tell you that you are now trespassing on my private property. That's my house there, on the other side of the dunes. Would you be offended if a lonely and harmless old widower invited you thence for a drink, if you drink, and then supper with an equally harmless old friend of mine? I meant Paul Slazenger. She accepted, and after supper I heard myself saying, if you'd rather stay here instead of the inn, you're certainly welcome. And I made her the same guarantee I made many times to Paul Slazenger. I promise not to bother you. So let's be honest. I said a little earlier that I had no idea how she'd come to share this house with me. Let's be honest. I invited her. She has turned me and this household upside down. Tell me how your parents died. I mean, those were the words of a woman who was quite used to turning people in any direction she chose, as though they were machine bolts and she were a monkey wrench. And if I had missed the warning signals on the beach, there were plenty more at supper. She behaved as though she were a paying customer in a fancy restaurant, screwing up her face after tasting a wine which I myself had sipped and declared potable, and declaring the veal to be overcooked and ordering Slazenger to send his serving back to the kitchen along with hers, and saying that she was going to plan the meals while she was here, since Paul's and my circulatory systems were obviously, since our complexions were so pasty and our gestures so listless, clogged up with cholesterol. She was outrageous! She sat across from a Jackson Pollock for which I had just been offered $2 million by an anonymous collector in Switzerland, and she said, I wouldn't give that a house room. So I asked her tartly, after a wink in Paul Slazenger's direction, what sort of picture might please her more. She replied that she wasn't on earth to be pleased, but to be instructed. I need information the way I need vitamins and minerals, she said. Judging from your pictures, you hate facts like poison. I suppose you would be happier looking at George Washington crossing the Delaware, I said. Who wouldn't, she said. But I tell you, what I'd really like to see there since our talk on the beach, which is, I said, arching my eyebrows and then winking at Slazenger again. I'd like a picture with some grass and dirt at the bottom, she said. Brown and green, I suggested. Fine, she said, and sky at the top. Blue, I said. Maybe with clouds, she said. Easily supplied, I said. And in between the sky and the ground, she said. A duck, I said. An organ grinder with his monkey, a sailor and his girl on a park bench. Not a duck, not an organ grinder, and not a sailor and his girl, she said. A whole lot of dead bodies lying every which way on the ground. And very close to us is the face of a beautiful girl, maybe 16 or 17. She is pinned under the corpse of a man, but she is still alive, and she is staring into the open mouth of a dead old woman whose face is only inches from hers. Out of that toothless mouth are spilling diamonds and emeralds and rubies. There was a silence. And then she said, You could build a whole new religion, and a much-needed one, too, on a picture like that. She nodded in the direction of the Pollock. All anybody could do with a picture like that is illustrate an advertisement for a hangover remedy or seasick pills. Slazenger asked her what had brought her to the Hamptons, since she didn't know anybody there. She replied that she hoped to find some peace and quiet so she could devote her full attention to writing a biography of her husband, the Baltimore brain surgeon. Slazenger preened himself as a man who had published 11 novels, and he patronized her as an amateur. "Everybody thinks he or she can be a writer," he said with airy irony. "Well, don't tell me it's a crime to try," she said. "It's a crime to think it's easy," he said. "But if you're really serious, you'll find out quick enough that it's the hardest thing there is." "Particularly so if you have absolutely nothing to say," she said. "Don't you think that's the main reason people find it so difficult? If they can write complete sentences and use a dictionary, isn't that the only reason they find writing hard? They don't know or care about anything?" Here, Slazenger stole a line from the writer Truman Capote, who died 5 years ago and who had a house only a few miles west of here. "I think you're talking about typing instead of writing," he said. She promptly identified the source of his witticism. "Truman Capote," she said. Slazenger covered himself nicely. "As everyone knows," he said. "If you didn't have such a kind face," she said, "I would suspect that you were making fun of me. But listen to this, which she only told me at breakfast this morning. Just listen to this, and then tell me who was toying with whom at that supper, which is now 2 weeks ago. Ms. Berman is not an amateur writing a biography of her late husband. That was just a story to cover her true identity and purpose for being here. She swore me to secrecy, and then confessed that she was really in the Hamptons to research and write a novel about working-class adolescents living in a resort community teeming in the summertime with the sons and daughters of millionaires. And this wasn't going to be her first novel either. It would be the 21st in a series of shockingly frank and enormously popular novels for young readers, several of which had been made into motion pictures. She had written them under the name of Polly Madison. I certainly will keep this secret, too, if only to save the life of Paul Slazenger. If he finds out who she really is now, after all his posturing as a professional writer, he will do what Terry Kitchen, the only other best friend I ever had, did. He will commit suicide. In terms of commercial importance in the literary marketplace, Circe Berman is to Paul Slazenger what General Motors is to a bicycle factory in Albania. Mum's the word. She said that first night that she collected pictures, too. I asked her what kind, and she said Victorian chromos of little girls on swings. She said she had more than 100 of them, all different, but all little girls on swings. "I suppose you think that's terrible," she said. "Not at all," I said, "just as long as you keep them safely caged in Baltimore." That first night, I remember, too, she asked Slazenger and me, and then the cook and her daughter, too, if we knew any true stories about local girls from relatively poor families who had married the sons of rich people. Slazenger said, "I don't think you'll even see that in the movies anymore." Celeste told her, "The rich marry the rich. Where have you been all your life?" To get back to the past, which is what this book is supposed to be all about, my mother gathered up the jewels that had fallen from the dead woman's mouth, but not the ones still inside there. Whenever she told the story, she was empathetic about that. She hadn't fished anything from the woman's mouth. Whatever had stayed in there was still the woman's very personal property. And Mother crawled away after nightfall, after the killers had all gone home. She wasn't from my father's village, and she would not meet him until they both crossed the lightly guarded border with Persia, about 70 miles from the scene of the massacre. Persian Armenians took them in. After they decided to go together to Egypt, my father did most of the talking, since Mother had a mouthful of jewels. When they got to the Persian Gulf, Mother sold the first of these compact treasures in order to buy them passage on a small freighter to Cairo via the Red Sea. And it was in Cairo that they met the criminal, Vartan Mamegonian, a survivor of an earlier massacre. "Never trust a survivor," my father used to warn me, with Vartan Mamegonian in mind, until you find out what he did to stay alive. This Mamegonian had grown rich manufacturing military boots for the British Army and the German Army, which would soon be fighting each other in World War I. He offered my parents low-paid work of the dirtiest kind. They were fools enough to tell him, since he was a fellow Armenian survivor, about Mother's jewels and their plans to marry and go to Paris and join the large and highly cultivated Armenian colony there. Mamegonian became the most ardent advisor and protector, eager to find them a safe place for the jewels and in a city notorious for its heartless thieves, but they had already put them in a bank. So, Mamegonian constructed a fantasy, which he proposed to trade for the jewels. He must have found San Ignacio, California in an atlas, since no Armenian had ever been there, and since no news of that sleepy farming town could have reached the Near East in any form. Mamegonian said he had a brother in San Ignacio. He forged letters from the brother to prove it. The letters said, moreover, that the brother had become extremely rich in a short time there. There were many other Armenians there, all doing well. They were looking for a teacher for their children who was fluent in Armenian and familiar with the great literature in that language. As an inducement to such a teacher, they would sell him a house and 20 acres of fruit trees at a fraction of their true value. Mamegonian's rich brother enclosed a photo of the house and a deed to it as well. If Mamegonian knew a good teacher in Cairo who might be interested, this non-existent brother wrote, Mamegonian was authorized to sell him the deed. This would secure the teaching job for father and make him one of the larger property owners in idyllic San Ignacio. 4. I have been in the art business, the picture business, so long now that I can daydream about the past as though it were a vista through a series of galleries, like the Louvre, perhaps, home of the Mona Lisa, whose smile has now outlived by 3 decades the post-war miracle of sateen derelict. The pictures in what must be the final gallery of my life are real. I can touch them, if I like, or, following the recommendations of the widow Berman, a.k.a. Polly Madison, sell them to the highest bidder, or, in some other way, in her thoughtful words, get them the hell out of here. In the imaginary galleries in the distance are my own abstract expressionist paintings, miraculously resurrected by the great critic for Judgment Day. And then pictures by Europeans, which I bought for a few dollars, or chocolate bars, or nylon stockings when a soldier, and then advertisements of the sort I had been laying out and illustrating before I joined the army. At about the same time, news of my father's death in the Bijou Theater in San Ignacio came. Still farther away are the magazine illustrations of Dan Gregory, whose apprentice I was from the time I was 17 until he threw me out. I was 1 month short of being 20 when he threw me out. Beyond the Dan Gregory Gallery are unframed works I made in my boyhood, as the only artist of any age or sort ever to inhabit San Ignacio. The gallery at the farthest removed from me in my dotage, though just inside the door I entered in 1916, is devoted to a photograph, not a painting. Its subject is a noble white house with a long winding driveway and porte cochere, supposedly in San Ignacio, which Vartan Mamegonian in Cairo told my parents they were buying with most of my mother's jewelry. That picture, along with a bogus deed, crawling with signatures and spattered with sealing wax, was in my parents' bedside table for many years, in the tiny apartment over father's shoe repair shop. I assumed that he had thrown them out with so many other mementos after mother died, but as I was about to board a railroad train in 1933 to seek my fortune in New York City during the depths of the Great Depression, father made me a present of the photograph. "If you happen to come across this house," he said in Armenian, "let me know where it is. Wherever it is, it belongs to me." I don't own that picture anymore. Coming back to New York City after having been one of 3 persons at father's funeral in San Ignacio, which I hadn't seen for 5 years, I ripped the photograph to bits. I did that because I was angry at my dead father. It was my conclusion that he had cheated himself and my mother a lot worse than they had ever been cheated by Vartan Mamegonian. It wasn't Mamegonian who made my parents stay in San Ignacio instead of moving to Fresno, say, where there really was an Armenian colony, whose members supported each other and kept the old language and customs and religion alive, and at the same time became happier and happier to be in California. Father could have become a beloved teacher again. Oh no, it wasn't Mamegonian who tricked him into being the unhappiest and loneliest of all the world's cobblers. Armenians have done brilliantly in this country during the short time they've been here. My neighbor to the west is F. Donald Kasabian, Executive Vice President of Metropolitan Life. So that right there, in exclusive East Hamptons and right on the beach, too, we have 2 Armenians side by side. What used to be J.P. Morgan's estate in Southamptons is now property of Kevork Havosundian, who also owned 20th Century Fox, until he sold it last week. And Armenians haven't succeeded only in business here. The great writer William Saroyan was an Armenian, and so is Dr. George Mintushian, the new president of the University of Chicago. Dr. Mintushian is a renowned Shakespeare scholar, something my father could have been. And Circe Berman has just come into the room and read what is on my typewriter, which is 10 of the lines above. She is gone again. She said again that my father obviously suffered from survivor syndrome. "Everybody who is alive is a survivor, and everybody who's dead isn't," I said, "so everybody alive must have the survivor syndrome. It's that or death." I am so damn sick of people telling me proudly that they are survivors. 9 times out of 10, it's a cannibal or a billionaire. You still haven't forgiven your father for being what he had to be, she said. That's why you're yelling now. I wasn't yelling, I said. They can hear you in Portugal, she said. That's where you'll wind up if you put out to sea from my private beach and sail due east, as she had figured out from the globe in the library. You wind up in Oporto, Portugal. You envy your father's ordeal, she said. I had an ordeal of my own, I said. In case you haven't noticed, I'm a one-eyed man. You told me yourself that there was almost no pain and that it healed right away, she said, which was true. I don't remember being hit, but only the approach of a white German tank and German soldiers all in white across a snow-covered meadow in Luxembourg. I was unconscious when I was taken prisoner and was kept that way by morphine until I woke up in a German military hospital in a church across the border in Germany. She was right. I had to endure no more pain in the war than a civilian experiences in a dentist chair. The wound healed so quickly that I was soon shipped off to a camp as just another unremarkable prisoner. Still, I insisted that I was entitled to a survivor's syndrome as my father. So she asked me 2 questions. The first one was this. Do you believe sometimes that you are a good person in a world where almost all of the other good people are dead? No, I said. Do you sometimes believe that you must be wicked, since all the good people are dead, and that the only way to clear your name is to be dead too? No, I said. You may be entitled to the survivor's syndrome, but you didn't get it, she said. Would you like to try for tuberculosis instead? How do you know so much about the survivor's syndrome, I asked her. This wasn't a boorish question to ask her, since she had told me during our first meeting on the beach that she and her husband, although both Jewish, had had no knowledge of relatives they might have been in Europe and who might have been killed during the Holocaust. They were both from families which had been in the United States for several generations and which had lost all contact with European relatives. I wrote a book about it, she said. Rather, I wrote about people like you, children of a parent who had survived some sort of mass killing. It's called The Underground. Needless to say, I have not read that or any of the Polly Madison books, although they seem, now that I have started looking around for them, as available as packs of chewing gum. Not that I would need to leave the house to get a copy of The Underground or any other Polly Madison book, Mrs. Berman informs me. The cook's daughter, Celeste, has every one of them. Mrs. Berman, the most ferocious enemy of privacy I ever knew, has also discovered that Celeste, although only 15, already takes birth control pills. The formidable widow Berman told me the plot of The Underground, which is this. 3 girls, 1 black, 1 Jewish, and 1 Japanese, feel drawn together and separate from the rest of the classmates for reasons they can't explain. They form a little club, which they call, again, for reasons they can't explain, The Underground. But then it turns out that all 3 have a parent or grandparent who has survived some man-made catastrophe and who, without meaning to, passed on to them the idea that the wicked were the living and that the good were dead. The black is descended from a survivor of the massacre of Ibo in Nigeria. The Japanese is a descendant of the survivor of the atom bombing of Nagasaki. The Jew is a descendant of the survivor of the Nazi Holocaust. The Underground is a wonderful title for a book like that, I said. You bet it is, she said. I am very proud of my titles. She really thinks that she's the cat's pajamas, and that everybody else is dumb, dumb, dumb. She said that painters should hire writers to name their pictures for them. The names of my pictures on my walls are Opus 9 and Blue and Burnt Orange and so on. My own most famous painting, which no longer exists, and which was 64 feet long and 8 feet high, and used to grace the entrance lobby of the GEFCO headquarters on Park Avenue, was called simply Windsor Blue, number 17. Windsor Blue was a shade of sateen Duralux, straight from the can. The titles are meant to be uncommunicative, I said. What's the point of being alive, she said, if you're not going to communicate? She still has no respect for my art collection, although during the 5 weeks she has now been in residence, she has seen immensely respectable people from as far away as Switzerland and Japan worship some of them as though the pictures were gods almost. She was here when I sold a Rothko right off the wall to a man from the Getty Museum for $1.5 million. What she said about this was, "Good riddance of bad rubbish. It was rotting your brain because it was absolutely nothing. Now give the rest of them the old heave-ho." She asked me just now, while we were talking about the survivor's syndrome, if my father wanted to see the Turks punished for what they had done to the Armenians. I asked him the same thing when I was about 8 years old, I guess. and thinking maybe life would be spicier if we wanted revenge of some kind, I said. Father put down his tools there in his little shop, and he stared out the window, I went on. And I looked out the window, too. There were a couple of Luma Indian men out there, I remember. The Luma reservation was only 5 miles away, and sometimes people passing through town would mistake me for a Luma boy. I liked that a lot. At the time, I thought it certainly beat being an Armenian. Father finally answered my question this way. All I want from the Turks is an admission that their country is an uglier and even more joyless place now that we are gone. I went for a manly tramp around my boundaries after lunch today and encountered my neighbor to the north on our mutual border, which runs about 20 feet north of my potato barn. His name is John Karpinski. He is a native. He is a potato farmer like his father, although his fields must now be worth about $80,000 an acre, since the second-story windows of houses built on them would have an ocean view. 3 generations of Karpinskis have been raised all on that property, so that to them, in an Armenian manner of speaking, it is their own sacred ancestral bit of ground at the foot of Mount Ararat. Karpinski is a huge man, almost always in bib overalls, and everybody calls him Big John. Big John is a wounded war veteran like Paul Slazenger and me, but he is younger than us, so his war was a different war. His war was the Korean War. And then his only son, Little John, was killed by a landmine in the Vietnam War. One war to a customer. My potato barn and the 6 acres that came with it used to belong to Big John's father, who sold them to dear Edith and her first husband. Big John expressed curiosity about Mrs. Berman. I promised him that our relationship was platonic, and that she had more or less invited herself, and that I would be glad when she returned to Baltimore. She sounds like a bear, he said. If a bear gets in your house, you'd better go to a motel until the bear's ready to leave again. There used to be lots of bears on Long Island, but there certainly aren't bears anymore. He said his knowledge of bears came from his father, who, at the age of 60, was treed by a grizzly in Yellowstone Park. After that, John's father read every book about bears he could get his hands on. I'll say this for that bear, said John. It got the old man reading books again. Ms. Berman is so goddamn nosy. I mean, she comes in here and reads what is in my typewriter without feeling the need to ask permission first. How come you never use semicolons, she'll say. Or, how come you chop it all up into little sections instead of letting it flow and flow? That sort of thing. And when I listen to her moving about this house, I not only hear her footsteps, I hear the opening and closing of drawers and cupboards, too. She has investigated every nook and cranny, including the basement. She came up from the basement one day and said, "Do you know you've got 63 gallons of Sateen Duralux down there?" She had counted them. It is against the law to dispose of Sateen Duralux in an ordinary dump because it has been found to degrade over time into a very deadly poison. To get rid of the stuff legally, I would have to ship it to a special disposal area near Pitchfork, Wyoming, and I have never got around to doing that. So there it sits in the basement after all these years. The one place on the property she hasn't explored is my studio, the potato barn. It is a very long and narrow structure without windows, with sliding doors and a pot-bellied stove at either end, built for the storage of potatoes and nothing else. The idea was this. A farmer might maintain an even temperature in there no matter what the weather, with the stoves and the doors, so that his potatoes would neither freeze nor sprout until he was ready to market them. It was structures with such unusual dimensions, in fact, along with what used to be very cheap property, which caused many painters to move out here when I was very young. And especially painters who were working on exceptionally large canvases. I would never have been able to work on the 8 panels comprising Windsor Blue No. 17 in a single piece if I hadn't rented that potato barn. The nosy widow Berman, a.k.a. Polly Madison, can't get into the studio or even take a peek inside because it has no windows and because 2 years ago, right after my wife died, I personally nailed the doors at one end shut from the inside with 6-inch spikes, and immobilized the doors at the other end on the outside from top to bottom with 6 big padlocks and massive hasps. I myself haven't been in there since. And yes, there is something in there. This is no shaggy dog story. After I die and am buried next to my darling Edith, and the executives of my estate open these doors at last, they will find more than just thin air in there. And it won't be some pathetic symbol, such as a paintbrush broken in two or my purple heart on an otherwise vacant and clean-swept floor. And there's no lame joke in there, like a painting of potatoes. as though I were returning the barn to potatoes, or a painting of the Virgin Mary wearing a derby and holding a watermelon or some such thing. And no self-portrait. And nothing with a religious message. Tantalizing? Here's a hint. It's bigger than a bread box and smaller than the planet Jupiter. Not even Paul Slazenger has come close to guessing what is in there. And he has said more than once that he doesn't see how our friendship can continue if I feel my secret would not be safe with him. The barn has become quite famous in the art world. After I show visitors the collection in the house, most of them ask if they can see what is in the barn as well. I tell them that they can see the outside of the barn if they like, and that the outside is in fact a significant landmark in art history. The first time Terry Kitchen used a paint spraying rig, his target was an old piece of beaver board he had leaned against the barn. As for what's inside the barn, I tell them, it's the worthless secret of a silly old man, as the world will discover when I have gone to the big art auction in the sky.